Good morning, Ohio State fans. Welcome back to the 11 Dubcast for Wednesday, November 26th. It is Thanksgiving Eve, and I'm joined on Thanksgiving Eve by newly minted Heisman Trophy voter and deputy editor at 11 Warriors, Mr. Dan Hope. Dan, congrats on your latest achievement. I hope you will cast your ballot for Julian Sayin. I know Jones is already trying to convince you to write one in for Caleb Downs, but hopefully you will not be swayed by any outside spheres of influence, and you'll be able to arrive at your own decision. But again, congrats, and how you doing today?
Doing good. I'm forbidden from saying anything about who I vote for until after the Heisman is announced. So I'll hit you with a whole no comment on who I might vote for, but I do appreciate the congratulations.
Yeah, well, you certainly deserve it, and yeah, no need to tip your pick at all. But I would hope that we know which way you're going to go. But then again, we still have a whole conference championship game to play, and
I
you
mean, it
did.
all depends on the next 2 weeks. I am not one of those people who will make a decision before we've seen all the games. So
And I'll tell you what, I think that the committee probably saw how often you were anointing Indiana above Ohio State in your power rankings this season and said, you know what, if Mendoza is justifiably ahead of saying by the time it's time to cast the vote, we trust Dan Hope to do the impartial and right thing. So maybe I think those Big Ten power rankings went a long way towards you achieving this distinction. So we're all very proud of you, and congrats to you for that. We have an interesting middle of the week topic. Obviously, we had a nice return of press coverage here at 11 Warriors featuring all the contributors of the beat today that were more than happy to talk about what, from your own perspective, was a very relaxed and just a bit of an atypical Ryan Day in terms of attitude compared to how he's been in prep for the game in years past. So would recommend you go check that out on the 11 Warriors YouTube channel if you haven't already. However, he did offer a comment on one area that I don't believe you guys touched on that I'd like to talk about with you today, Dan. But before we get into that, we do want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor at the 11 Dubcast and 11 Warriors this Ohio State football season. That would be First Bank of Central Ohio. From game day to work day, First Bank of Central Ohio is proud to support the business owners that keep Central Ohio thriving. They're locally owned, business focused, and always in your corner. Give them a visit at fbcentralohio.com. So, in case you are someone that is exclusively focused on Ohio State football and not the sport of football at large, our dear Charles Chip Kelly, who was as recently as last season the offensive coordinator for the Ohio State Buckeyes, the reigning national champion Ohio State Buckeyes, left shortly. I believe it was shortly after Jim Knowles also left as defensive coordinator during the offseason and took a job with the Las Vegas Raiders on Pete Carroll's staff and became, I believe, the highest paid coordinator in the NFL. And unfortunately, things didn't work out so great. The Raiders, who as recently as about a decade ago had not only one of the best offensive lines in the NFL, but one of the best, frankly, in recent memory. That's how Derek Carr had that career resurgence, and that's what also I think enabled Marshawn Lynch to have a nice brief little run with the Raiders back when they were still in Oakland. That offensive line fell from grace pretty dramatically. And granted, they had to deal with some issues in terms of injuries and whatnot, but after drafting Ashton Genty, the runner-up in the Heisman Trophy voting last year with a very high draft pick, and trading, I believe, for Geno Smith, there were expectations that given the success Chip Kelly had with the Raiders or given the success Chip Kelly had with Ohio State, that he was going to bring over some more immediate success for the Raiders, given the parts in play there. The offensive line, frankly, is one of the worst I have ever seen, and did not permit a lot of success for any of the skill players within the Raiders offense, nor for Chip Kelly himself. And after the Raiders lost over the weekend, Chip Kelly was subsequently dismissed from Pete Carroll's staff. Carroll, interestingly enough, in the pressers in wake of the dismissal, directly invoked the fact that he gave a lot of leeway to Kelly because of the success he had at Ohio State last year, which now that he is a free agent again, and given that we've seen, perhaps not explicitly at Ohio State, but we've seen around college football a lot of these cases where these highly touted, at least in terms of their previous accomplishments, coordinators come in and serve in a bit of an analyst role. There would perhaps be some interest, I would think, in Chip Kelly coming back to Ohio State for a college football playoff run, given how integral of the run he or integral to the run he was last season. So that was something that Ryan Day talked about in his pressers yesterday, Dan. And I'm curious if you can offer some perspective on that, what you think maybe the likelihood is that he would come back for that, and how interested you would be personally in seeing Kelly folded in for a late postseason run.
Yeah, so Ryan Day, as you would expect, 4 days before of a Michigan game, did not particularly want to get into that topic on Tuesday. He said, I would say we're not thinking about that right now. It's just too much going on. I do think right now we have great chemistry, but we got to be on our game as a coaching staff this week. Said, at the end of his answer, right now we're going to stick with what we've got. And so it's certainly
He did smile when he said it,
he
though.
did. Oh, he did. And that kind of goes back to what you said before about, it was a loose, confident, there's been times in the past this week where it's been a very button up, short answer, Ryan Day. He was not that today. He seemed to be in a very upbeat mood during his press conference today. And that was one of the examples of that he was not taken aback by that question. I'm sure he expected that it might come because we were talking about it in our company Slack on some. I think I made a comment on it before he got fired, just knowing it was probably coming. Like, could we see Chip Kelly come back to Ohio State as an offensive analyst? And I would say that I was half joking, but not really, because I do think that it would make sense. First and foremost, like Chip and Ryan Day are like very close friends. So if Chip's just looking for something to do here for the rest of the season, I think it would be natural for Chip to come back. Now, as Ryan Day mentioned, he said, I think we have great chemistry right now. So I think anytime you bring in someone of Chip Kelly's stature, you bring someone in like that as an analyst, the question could then become, is it going to be a distraction of some sort? Is he going to, loom over? If Brian Hartline makes a bad play call, you're going to have people saying Chip should be calling a play. So I think those are the kind of things that you maybe have to guard against. But at the same time, Chip has already worked with this entire offensive staff except Tyler Bowen. And so you would think if you want an extra set of eyes, an extra someone to help game plan, particularly in the college football playoff, he's someone who could come in pretty seamlessly and at the very least add some unique perspective. You think about he's just spent, did not have much success in the NFL, but has spent time in the NFL where maybe he's got some fresh perspectives that he wouldn't have had when he was last in the building 10 months ago. So, it's an interesting conversation. I think it's one of those things that, we might have to circle back in a couple weeks and see what happens there. The one game plan from last year Ohio State would not want to replicate from Chip Kelly would be the one that happened in this game a year ago. So I think for this week, the focus is on beating Michigan with the current staff and go from there, but not without knowing anything about whether there's been any conversation. Ryan Day said there hasn't been any conversation, any thought about it yet with Chip Kelly. I wouldn't be shocked if Chip Kelly came back to Ohio State in some capacity, but that's not me having any inside information that it will happen. That's just me connecting dots and saying, I think it could make sense.
Yeah, assuming that they take care of business this weekend, I would think that those conversations probably wouldn't reach a more serious capacity until after the Big Ten championship, when they would have a few weeks to get him integrated prior to the start of the college football playoff. But it is, I think you bring up a good point relative to the chemistry that Day invoked in his answer, because in a very, not even just talking on football, but in a very general business professional sense, working as or having somebody work under you as a subordinate, having that person fill in your position, and then you leaving the organization and then coming back to the organization within the same year and then having to serve as the subordinate to someone that was a subordinate under you within the last year, I think is probably just it's a bit of a hairy situation to navigate, I think. And given the Chip Kelly, the relationship that he has with Ryan Day, it would probably still be smoothed over fine. I still think it might be a little bit awkward just to have Brian Hartline working under you a year ago, and then to having to be answering to that guy as the new offensive coordinator. I think now it might be a little bit of a tricky
It is
dynamic to
funny though, because
navigate.
we were having the same exact conversation when Chip got hired as offensive coordinator, because it was all about, well, Ryan played for Chip Kelly and now Chip's going to report to him, and Chip made the joke about, I'm not Al Haig, I know what my place is here. So you'd think if anyone can make it work, it would be Chip Kelly and Ryan Day. But I think your point's valid, because I think one thing we didn't know at the time when he got hired, but became more clear after the season, when Ryan Day said that he and Chip had conversations about the likelihood that he would go back to the NFL after 1 year. I think the plan was always Chip comes in for 1 year, Brian Hartline unofficially maybe kind of offensive coordinator in waiting, and it was kind of Chip comes in for 1 year, Brian learns from him, then Brian becomes the offensive coordinator. And so I don't think Chip coming back would cause any problems, but you think about it in the context too of, there's a lot of head coaching jobs open right now. There's surely schools out there that are interested in Brian Hartline. Would you want to do anything that would potentially risk upsetting Brian Hartline and potentially increase his interest in looking at some of those opportunities that are out there? That could be something to consider as well.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point you make, though, in terms of Chip already having to kind of navigate a similar dynamic with Ryan Day in terms of coming in last year. Obviously, the timelines are extremely different. I mean, that was what I don't know about several, but I think multiple decades of difference between when Day was a player under Kelly versus the dynamic that they
And it
had
was
last
also
year.
February, not late November.
Right, exactly. So there was more time, I think, and a less sensitive timeline, I think, in terms of figuring things out versus him if he were to come back trying to get integrated back in as quickly as he could in a lesser capacity than he was less than a year ago. So it would be tricky, but I think that that's more of in a general sense. The fact that Chip has that experience already navigating a similar uh, relationship and dynamic, I'd be optimistic that he'd be able to figure out and make it a net positive for Ohio State. But what's happened with Chip Kelly, I think, brings up another interesting subject here, just relative to coordinators. I mean, it's interesting. They had I forget the name of the award off the top of my head, but they announced the finalists for
Royals Award.
the Broyles Award for the top coordinators in college football yesterday, and Matt Patricia obviously was among those names, given how historically brilliant Ohio State's defense has been this year. Some people might even call him the front runner for the award, honestly, and it certainly wouldn't shock anyone if he ends up getting it. But given there was it's important to remember, and this has been commonly invoked in talking about Patricia, that there was a healthy amount of skepticism from at least part of the fan base about when he was brought in, given the lack of experience of doing this at the collegiate level and having that degree of separation from the NFL and having, not the most graceful exit from his most recent activity with the Detroit Lions. Obviously, the hires worked out very well, but part of the reason there was that kind of anxiety to begin with was because he was having probably the biggest shoes to fill in terms of just replacement, given Jim Knowles was literally coming off a national championship. And although there was a lot of bad blood around the way the exit went, a lot of those sour grapes were around the fact that this is someone who's commonly been identified as one of, if not the best defensive coordinator in college football, and he's going to a conference rival in the form of Penn State. That worked out about as well for Penn State, frankly, as Chip Kelly did with the Las Vegas Raiders. And Kelly was commonly touted as one of the key reasons that Ohio State won a national championship last year. It was not there was some skepticism about how Brian Hartline would evolve into an offensive coordinator from just being a position receivers coach. And a lot of the skepticism around him also was filling those shoes that Kelly had left because of how well he did last season. I'm not saying that Hartline has done as well of a job with the offense as Patricia has with the defense, but the offense at least has, I think, maintained stride largely given the talent left that was available. But I think I've always been a believer up to this season that coordinators are so, like, it's so hard to retain them with how crazy the coaching carousel is, not just at the college level, but in the sport of football generally. People are always trying to either move up in their own position within the school that they're at or get on to the next level of the NFL, that it's hard to lock down guys for several years in those roles, no matter how positively they may be contributing. It's one of the key reasons I think Alabama went on the run they did, was because they had Kirby Smart backing up Saban with running the defense for so long. And then obviously he finally went on to Georgia and has had his own success there. But I think that this current situation, given the departure of those two top flight coordinators, them not succeeding at their next gigs, and then having Ohio State fill in with candidates that frankly some people were skeptical about, but still do fine, if not improve upon the job that was done before, kind of begs the question, how important is having a rock solid, consistent coordinator in this day and age when there's so many people available to potentially do the job? Is it really more about the talent in place and the head coach running the show above them, or does it really come down to the coordinators and them potentially calling plays and coverages and making the decisions? I'm curious what your perspective is on that, given the recent developments around the men that were doing this role that just left Ohio State, their lack of success, and the guys that have their successors that have filled in for them this season.
I think all of those things you mentioned matter. I mean, of course, the head coach matters. Of course, the talent matters. But position coaches around the coordinator matter. But I still think coordinators are very important. I think, particularly on the defensive side of the ball, I mean, I think Ryan Davis hit a home run with Matt Patricia. I think he just hired a guy who's fantastic at his job. And I think that if he hadn't made a home run hire, it's far more likely the defense would have taken a step back than it would have actually improved upon last year's top ranked defense. I think he just made a fantastic hire and ended up with a better coordinator than he had last year. I mean, Ryan Day said it himself, like, he's spending very little time with the defense this year. He's basically letting Matt Patricia run the show. If he didn't have a great defensive coordinator, he would not be able to do that. And that would also affect the offense, because I think on the offensive side of the ball at Ohio State, the coordinators may be a little less important because Ryan Day himself is very involved in the offense, is a great offensive mind. But I think, the defensive coordinator under Ryan Day has always been the more important position. And I mean, we've seen the other side of that. I mean, we can go back to the Kerry Combs era and how bad the defense
Let's
was.
not.
Right. But I'm just saying, like, if we're going to illustrate the importance of
Yeah.
coordinators, I think that
Yes.
illustrates it right there. I mean, you, that was the fear when Jim Knowles left, is like, we could take a huge step back. And to Ryan Day's credit, he made a fantastic hire. That didn't happen. But I still think, you just look back over time. I mean, you go back to 2014, you have this great offense under Tom Herman. Then you hand the keys to Tim Beck and Ed Warner, and things fall apart, even though you brought back pretty much all the stars from that team the year
How
before.
many skeletons are you going to drag out of the closet here, man?
Well, you're asking me to make my point. I'm going to make the point. But, I think to your point
I'm
about
just kidding.
Alabama, I think what Nick Saban did really well is he just consistently, you look at, he had Kirby Smart, but he also had Dan Lanning. He had Steve Sarkisian and he had Lane Kiffin. He did a phenomenal job of, when somebody left, he was able to replace them with another person who could do the job just as well. And I think, particularly on the defensive side of the ball, that's certainly something Ryan Day did. I think with Brian Hartline, to me, I think, honestly, it starts this week for the rest of the season is really kind of a jury on Brian Hartline as an offensive play caller, because I think there have been a few growing pains, particularly in the run game. I think that was to be expected. I think now the rest of the season is where we really find out how good of an offensive coordinator Brian Hartline is. And, where Ryan Day evaluates Brian Hartline in terms of that question right now may determine whether or not he actually makes an effort to bring Chip Kelly into the building. Not, to be clear, not at all saying he would bring in Chip Kelly and he would take over play calling. That will not happen, period. But it could determine whether or not Ryan Day sees a reason to bring Chip Kelly back into the building to help with the game planning process.
Yeah, I think that the biggest area that he could contribute, and probably what's fueling a large amount of this, speculation around whether or not he comes back as an analyst, is that it'd be very easy for him to come in and offer a lot of valuable perspective in a consultant capacity about what Ohio State can do to improve upon its run game going into the playoff down the stretch, given his familiarity with and success in that area last season. So obviously not working with the dynamic duo of Judkins and Henderson anymore, but I think that given the pieces in place and his familiarity with the offensive linemen on the team, there certainly would be potential for improvement and assistance there. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. It is a nice. I can't. I'm glad that somebody asked him about it this week. Obviously, he's not going to have an answer given there's bigger things on his mind, on Ryan Day's mind, but given the proximity of the dismissal to the game, it was certainly something that probably should have been brought up this week. And the fact that he coyly smiled about it, the fact that he didn't just, grumpily dismiss it, makes you maybe think a little bit, if you're into reading tea leaves and body language, that it's something that could be in the back pocket for Ohio State down the
I
stretch
will
here.
say this: Jim Knowles will not be back as a defensive analyst. If Penn State fires its staff here next week, Jim Knowles will not be back as a defensive analyst.
I don't think Patricia needs him. I think we're more than content with what's happening on that side of the ball to this point. But I don't know. Maybe Bryce Underwood will throw for 400 yards this weekend, and then we'll suddenly be calling for Jim Knowles to be back. Heaven forbid. I'm certainly not hoping that happens, nor do I think that happens. But never say never. We'll see if anybody is calling for the return of Jim Knowles after this weekend. But Patricia's done an exemplary job to this point, given the standard that Jim Knowles left. And I would imagine that success not only continues into this weekend, but also into Ohio State's college football playoff run and quest to defend its national title. So it'll be interesting to see if Day does enlist any additional help down the stretch, at least for the offensive side. But one game at a time, and we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Until then, we have Thanksgiving to look forward to. But Dan, I appreciate you joining us on Thanksgiving Eve to talk about the latest developments from Ryan Day's press conference ahead of the game this week. And then we've got Black Friday after that. And we will be previewing the game on Friday morning with the return of the original Dubcast founder, Johnny Ginter, will be making his return to the show. I believe the last episode we did together was 529, and this episode is 605. So it's been nearly 100 episodes since we last talked to Johnny, but he will be back to talk about the game with yours truly, and I look very much forward to doing that on Friday, and then we will have the game to rejoice in on Saturday. So, Dan, thank you very much for joining us, and once again, congrats on your distinction as a Heisman Trophy voter this year, and thank you for tuning into the 11 Dubcast. Thanks to our sponsor, First Bank of Central Ohio. We will be back Friday. Until then, enjoy Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving to you and all your families. And keep Ohio State in your hearts. Take care, folks. We'll see you soon. Go Bucs.